Okay, I'm sure every single person who's played this game has had this happen to them.
Earthworm Jim.
Today on Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look at Earthworm Jim, a rather popular but somewhat polarizing game due to the incredibly weird and imaginative nature of the characters and levels and whatnot. When it comes to opinions about this game, there isn't really much of a middle ground. You either love it or you hate it. However, Earthworm Jim was originally released on the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo consoles before arriving on a plethora of other devices, eventually landing on the PC about a year later. And you know what that means. This is a port. Now don't get me wrong, there's a lot of ports out there that work perfectly fine. Porting a game does not intrinsically doom it to bugs and obscurity. Unfortunately, the DOS version of Earthworm Jim does have some major control bugs, along with some physics glitches and some other discrepancies when compared to the console originals. At the same time though, it has a password system for resuming your game from where you left off, something the original games didn't have. And really, all the charm and everything is still here, so it's kinda like how it was with Bubble Bobble. This isn't a bad game, it's just a bad port. The DOS version of Earthworm Jim was primarily developed by Shiny Entertainment and originally published by Activision in 1995. However, numerous other companies have been involved with the development or publishing of the game, including Rainbow Arts, Playmates Interactive Entertainment, Interplay, Sega, Virgin Interactive. I mean, seriously, so many different companies have been involved with this game, it's really hard to decipher who was responsible for what, so I'm not even gonna try. It's a one-player action platformer which supports two different VGA 256 color screen resolutions, 320 by 224 and 320 by 240, switching between them for various reasons. Now, there's actually a very odd thing about this, but I'm not going to get into it until near the end of the episode. However, 320 by 224 is the resolution the game was originally designed for, as it's the resolution the Sega Genesis works at. Its audio support is also surprisingly limited for a mid-90s game, only supporting Sound Blaster cards, Pro Audio Spectrum cards, and the Windows sound system. As for its current release state, the game's still commercial but easily obtainable from the Good Old Games website at www.gog.com, along with its sequel for $10. It's also available on Steam, but more expensive if you go that route. If you want a physical copy of the game, then you're going to have a much easier time finding copies of the Genesis and SNES originals. The PC version is nearly impossible to find, and it can run the entire gamut of prices when you do. So if you're just looking to play the DOS version and not collect it, then I'd stick with the GOG release. Though to be perfectly honest, the Genesis version is probably the best one to go with if you've never actually played the game before. The story of the game revolves around annelid-turned-superhero Earthworm Jim, who is just an average, everyday earthworm foraging around and dodging crows when one day an ultra-high-tech, indestructible super space cybersuit lands right on top of him. As the suit's particles interact with Jim's wormy flesh, a light-speed evolution takes place as he becomes large enough and smart enough to operate the suit. And yes, most of that was taken right from the manual. Doesn't end there though. After Jim discovers more of the features of the suit, such as its bright red plasma blaster, he hears some commotion in the distance and goes to investigate. Apparently, an intergalactic bounty hunter known as Psychro was tracking the suit for an evil queen who wants the suit so she can be even more beautiful than her imprisoned twin sister, Princess What's-Her-Name. Thus begins Jim's quest to find this princess while dodging all of the queen's minions who want to get their hands on Jim's supersuit. At first, the gameplay in Earthworm Jim is going to seem pretty standard for a run-and-gun platformer, but there's a number of twists on the standard formula that help set this game apart. Firstly, beyond moving around, you have 3 controls: jump, shoot, and whip. Now it's that third one there that really makes the game interesting, because not only do you have the ability to shoot things, but you also have the ability to whip things using Jim himself, which does greater damage than the plasma blaster and can also be used to swing from hooks. Now that said, it takes a moment for the whip move to do its thing, and thus it takes a lot of practice to really make effective use of this move. Which immediately leads us into some of the control problems present in this version of the game. Now there's actually a tiny delay between movement controls and action controls. Now what this means is that if, say for example, you press left and jump at the exact same time, you actually end up moving left slightly before you jump. Now this is actually fairly common with most platformers, but here the delay is almost measurable, making it incredibly difficult to perform some of the jumps and maneuvers you're expected to get through. Also, having originally been a console game, you'd expect the joystick and gamepad controls to be the best way to go, except for 2 problems. The first is that the screen for selecting which buttons do what is completely broken. The controls you set for joysticks and gamepads are not the controls you end up getting, and thus you have to mess around trying to guess which buttons are going to end up where until they finally end up where you want them to be. The other problem is that there's certain moments in the game where it completely locks up the movement controls on joysticks and gamepads, and the problem persists until you basically restart the game. To that end, if you want to use a joystick or gamepad with this game, make sure you use DOSBox's keymapper to map every single button, including directional control, to keyboard keys. Anyways, getting back into the gameplay itself, there's actually a few more moves you can perform. When you repeatedly press the jump button while airborne, the suit will spin Jim around like a helicopter blade, slowing down your descent, allowing you to reach platforms more easily. Jim's also capable of catching the edge of a ledge and pulling himself up to safety, which, believe it or not, was a very uncommon thing to see in video game characters do by this point, and it's a welcome addition to the game considering how incredibly difficult the original games were. This DOS version, though, is, much to my surprise, easier than the console versions, which is odd considering all the same elements and enemy placements are here, so it didn't quite make sense at first. But after a bit of gameplay, I finally figured out what's going on. This DOS version is slower than the console versions, and it doesn't have anything to do with DOSBox either, considering the speed difference is incredibly small and both the console and DOS games sync at 60 frames a second. And I think what's going on is that in this DOS version, they tried to sync everything precisely to pixels, whereas video game consoles don't actually define sprite positions in the same way, and thus movement could still be fluid without being pixel accurate. That's my guess anyways. There's not a lot of other general things to say about the gameplay though. You have a health counter at the top of the screen, represented in a range from 0 to 100%. Most things that cause damage do about 10% damage, though it varies, and the health pickups lying around restore 4% each. Changing the difficulty level from the options screen also affects how much damage you take, if nothing else. Your plasma blaster normally acts like a machine gun. If you run out of ammo, you can only fire for short bursts, as opposed to constantly. Plus, you can also find mega plasma power-ups that give you a single shot of extreme plasma power, destroying just about any normal enemies in its wake and doing lots of damage to boss enemies. The only way to really get across the variety in this game is to talk about each individual level, so let's start at the start of the game in New Junk City. This is a very basic level with a bunch of hidden things to get you used to the nature of the game, including a cow you launch into orbit near the start of the level. Don't ask. The boss of the level is named Chuck, possibly because of his tendency to upchuck endless amounts of fish at you. You defeat him by knocking the boxes he tries to drop on you onto a springboard, launching those boxes right up into him. All other attacks just make him go into vomit mode. Now, between levels, you have to race against Psychro on your pocket rocket, dodging asteroids and collecting fuel pods. If you win the race, you move on to the next level. If you win the race and collect at least 50 fuel pods, you get an extra continue. If you lose the race, you have to face off against Psychro in a shooting match before moving on. There's also atomic accelerators to give you a boost of speed, and shields you can activate on command, which briefly protect you from the asteroids. I should also note that you're protected from the asteroids while accelerated too, even though it looks like you can technically still hit them. The next level is called What the Heck, as you travel through a demonic world of fire and brimstone under command of Evil the Cat. There's a fight with a fire-breathing snowman and a few lawyers you defeat by knocking their briefcases away with your whip attack before shooting them. But the boss fight is interesting. When you first go up against Evil the Cat, he's got your suit commandeered and you have to dodge his fireball attacks until he stupidly burns away the support for the platform he's on. Then you have to kill him 9 times as he comes at you from various angles. Basically, you just gotta react as fast as possible if you want to survive. The next level is called Down the Tubes, which starts off simple enough, though there's these enemies you can't actually pass by unless you carefully skirt yourself over them on ceiling rails, or ride on a giant hamster that'll eat them up. There's also a couple underwater pod sections, which can be a little nerve-wracking, but it isn't until you get up to the pod race where things get really intense. The pod race section is treated as its own separate level in the PC version, but it's technically still a part of Down the Tubes. Unlike the earlier pod sections, in this one you get 99 seconds to navigate a very long but not too complicated course. Since the pods are made of glass and somewhat fragile, you have to take care not to smash it up too much, but at the same time, you also need to go pretty fast to make the time limit. This section takes a lot of practice, but once you've done it at least once before, it gets much easier to do it in the future. Then you go face to face against Bob the Goldfish. Man, that was an epic boss fight. The next level is Not a Problem, where you fight Major Mucus in a bungee jumping battle to the death over a stretch of 3 separate rounds. In each round, Major Mucus becomes smarter and fights better. The only real tips I have for surviving this section is to get away from Major Mucus if he starts to corner you, and to make sure you only ever touch him when performing an attack. And if he starts to spin like crazy, get out of the way. The next level is called Level 5, for lack of a better name, and features a bunch of high-tech machines, lightning, escalators, that sort of thing, all created by Professor Monkey for a head. He makes various appearances throughout the level, and also happened to be the one who made Jim's supersuit before losing it somehow. In fact, there's a couple moments here where Jim's separated from his suit, but they're not too challenging. The really hard parts are the 2 reflex challenges, when you're in a cage ball of some sorts, and have to shoot down enemies from random directions. There's also supposed to be a section where the lights go out, but I've never actually seen it, nor do I know how to get to it. This brings us to the level For Pete's Sake, arguably the most challenging part of the entire game. Pete happens to be one of Earthworm Jim's pals, a happy-go-lucky puppy who's just trying to find his way home. Just don't let him get injured or this happens. Yeah, this level is infamous amongst fans of this game for being notoriously challenging, since you have to basically guide Pete through the level and protect him from all harm, since if he gets hurt even slightly, you go back a ways and have to do 1 or more parts of the level all over again. Made even more ridiculous by the fact that there's a part near the end where you can end the level immediately, or whip Pete over his doghouse to go down an even more treacherous route. Worth some extra lives so you can pull it off, but to be perfectly honest, you gotta be some kind of masochist to want to go down that path. Now, if this was the original Genesis game, the next level would have been Intestinal Distress, but for some reason this level was cut from virtually every version of the game except the Genesis and Sega CD versions. I'm not really sure why, nor have I ever actually played the level, but it's not here, so it's a moot point anyways. Which leads us to the final level, Buttville. No, I am not kidding about that name. This level is primarily made up of spiky falls of doom that put your helicopter floating skills to the test. There's also a bunch of enemies that can instantly kill you if you're not careful, but thankfully you can whip them out of existence with some well-timed jump attacks. Eventually you'll reach the end of the level and go up against the final boss, the evil queen pulsating, bloated, festering, sweaty, pus-filled, malformed slug for a butt. Yeah, that's seriously what she's called in the manual. Overall, this DOS version of Earthworm Jim feels rushed and poorly tested, but it still plays okay, not to mention has great CD audio music compared to the console versions. Still, if you've never played the game before and want to give it a go, I recommend going for the Genesis version, or even the Sega CD version if you have the option, simply because they control better, and while they are harder thanks to running at the correct speed and not having a password system, you're not going to end up dying due to physics malfunctions or button delays. If you are going to play the DOS version though, there's something you need to keep in mind when running it in DOSBox. Firstly, make sure you set the cycles count to max. Secondly, when you start the game up, make sure you select option 2, which supposedly only runs the game in 320 by 240 resolution. However, it doesn't actually work that way. No matter which option you pick, the gameplay is going to happen at 320 by 224. The difference is in the display frequency timings. The timings necessary for the proper 320 by 224 mode simply don't work nicely in DOSBox, leading to all kinds of frame rate issues. So yeah, basically what I'm saying is pick the straight up 320 by 240 mode and don't be confused that you're seeing the game run at 320 by 224. Also, if you're running the physical copy of the game, make sure you create a QBin CD image pair and image mount it in DOSBox to get the CD audio music working properly. The CD audio music is also pretty loud compared to the sound effects, so you'll probably have to use DOSBox's mixer command to turn that down a bit. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next Saturday for episode 115, we're taking a look at a game that had 2 demo releases. One featuring a single mission, and another featuring 3 different missions. Now, of course, we're going to be taking a look at the full game, so if you think you know which game it is, then send your guess to adg@pixelships.com and stay tuned as we take a look at a game I've just been itching to play for a long time now.